Welcome to the Thriving Leaders podcast, where we dive into real conversations that help leaders grow, teams flourish, and organisations thrive. I'm your host, Claire Gray, Leadership and Team Facilitator at Thriving Culture. I'm also the author of Thriving Leaders, Learn the Skills to Lead Confidently. This podcast is filled with practical tools, tips, actions, and insights that you can immediately apply so you can lead confidently now. In Season 2 of the Thriving Leaders podcast, I'm interviewing thought leaders from around the world to pick their brains on what it takes to build a thriving team. This is helping me write my second book, Thriving Teams, which will be out later in the year in 2025. I hope you enjoy the podcast. In today's episode, I'm joined by Claire de Carteret, Managing Director for APAC at Gallup. If you're familiar with Gallup, you'll know them as global leaders in research on employee engagement, workplace wellbeing, and strengths-based development. In this powerful conversation, Claire shares Gallup's groundbreaking insights on what drives high performance in teams, the importance of meaningful conversations, and why connection and purpose matter more than ever. We explore the enduring 12 elements of engagement, how strengths can unlock individual and team potential, and what the data tells us about creating cultures where people want to do their best work. Whether you're a team leader, executive, or aspiring leader, this episode will give you practical and actionable strategies to elevate engagement and performance in your team. Let's dive in. Hello and welcome to the Thriving Leaders podcast. Today I have Claire de Carteret, who's the Managing Director for APAC at Gallup. Gallup is well known for their leading expertise in global survey research, leadership development, and employee wellbeing. Claire not only leads APAC in terms of the strategic direction and shaping client solutions, but she also leads and is part of the team herself. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Claire also spells her name the correct way, which is a bit of a Claire joke because I feel like it's the first thing that comes up when there's two Claires. How do you spell your name? So welcome, Claire.
Thank you so much for having me. Yes, all the letters, that A, I, R, and E. It's definitely the correct way to spell it.
Yeah, it's funny.
Claires.
We were actually just talking before we hit record about last names, and it made me just think that whenever I'm spelling my name, my surname's Gray. And I'm always like Claire with an I and an E and Gray with an A, all the vowels, which you just said. But my maiden name was Whitehill, where I'd get Whithill and Whitehall. So I felt like I was always spelling my surname and thought that would change when I got married, but it didn't. So there you go. Awesome.
Thank you for having me. I'm really looking forward to the conversation today.
Thanks, Claire. So we all know from the research that employee engagement leads to high performance, but what evidence supports this? And in your research at Gallup, what evidence supports that we should focus on employee engagement with our people?
Well, there's a lot of different definitions of engagement that exist out there. First of all, I will say that Gallup's definition of engagement is when you're psychologically connected to your work and your needs at work are being met. So it's really different to rational satisfaction, which is really you can be satisfied but not be high performing. You can be satisfied and not be engaged. Gallup's study of engagement came out of the study of high performance. So effectively what we did was we took 80 different work groups and we were looking at, so half of those 80,000 work groups were high performing and the other half were low performing or mediocre. And we ran them all through a battery of questions. What we were looking for, what were the conditions that were required for high performance? So we use the word engagement and performance interchangeably because really what we measure for in our construct of engagement and when we refer to engagement, we're talking about the conditions required for high performance. That's where I'll start. So engagement and performance is interchangeable. It's the conditions required for high performance. And then every year we go in with a meta-analysis, which is a study of studies. We take all the different studies and we look for the common patterns. And what we're doing with that is we're looking at whether these conditions still matter to high performance. So within any organization, you can have hundreds of work groups. There could be two work groups in the same function. So let's take sales, for example. So they're in the same organization, in the same function, in the same role. One of those work groups is in the top quartile of the Gallup database, and the other one's in the bottom. One of them's got the conditions required for the high performance, those 12 conditions, and the other one, the needs are not being met. We love it when organizations measuring and tracking engagement over time, and they ask us to do what we call a business impact analysis, where we go in and we're linking the work groups that have got the highest engagement to their performance outcomes. Things like sales, productivity, attrition, turnover, psychosocial injury, and stress claim. So we can actually go in and understand within that organization, are your most highly engaged teams more effective and more productive, and are they thriving across the metrics that matter to you as an organization?
Excellent. How interesting. You mentioned these 12 conditions of high performance. So, have those conditions changed over time? And tell us a little bit about some of those conditions of high performance.
Yeah, that's a really good question, because I think when it comes back to this word about engagement, many people think they're measuring engagement. They might be measuring motivation, or they might be measuring satisfaction. The 12 elements in the construct that kind of coins the term engagement, affectionately known as the Q12, which basically just stands for 12 questions, organized in a hierarchy of needs, similar to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So it starts with basic needs. I know what's expected of me at work, and I have the materials and equipment I need to do my job right. Then it goes into teamwork and belongingness, managerial support, and finally learning and growth. Have they changed over time? They have not changed over time. Those 12 conditions, the conditions required for people to thrive at work, there are additional items that we measure on top of the Q12. They measure other things. So right now we're doing a lot of what we call Q12 plus. So we're measuring the presence of respect in a work group, which is really important. Obviously, most important. We measure overall well-being. We measure some other cultural elements like inclusion and belongingness. But those 12 conditions seem to be enduring, which is why we do that meta-analysis every year, just to go in and say, are these still important? And when you look at the themes, like in the next, so it goes basic needs, and then the next level is around managerial support. And it's things like, at work, I have the opportunity to do what I do best, which is effectively saying, I can use my strengths to make a contribution. Acknowledgement and recognition is in there. Someone's recognized me in the last 7 days. Someone encourages my development. Someone cares about me as a person. These are all really basic human needs that actually, when you think about it, it's important to all of us every day. And so that's why they're pretty enduring over a longitudinal study.
Yeah, excellent. And you mentioned like the basic needs and the managerial support, and then you also said that teamwork and belongingness. What kind of sits in that teamwork space? Because obviously I'm writing my book about thriving teams, so I'm quite interested in that area.
Yeah, so there's a few things that sit in that one that we measure as part of that construct and those conditions required for high performance. One of them is my opinions count.
Yeah.
So listen to me, hear me. The other one is my coworkers are also committed to quality work. So it's this really, it's the psychological need that we're all in it together.
Yeah.
We've got a shared purpose. I have a best friend at work that's highly controversial, that particular item. And that one is controversial because of the extreme language. I have a best friend at work. But really, what that is measuring is really demonstrably linked to safety, both physical and psychological safety, and attrition. You know, if you've got a best friend at work, someone that cares about you, you're more likely to show up. You're more likely to have each other's back. You know, and Chris Peterson, who was one of the founders of positive psychology said when it comes to well-being, other people matter. That's measuring that presence of there's someone else here looking out for me.
Yeah. Excellent. I'm going to come back to that question because I'm also quite intrigued by that. So a lot of the research, especially over the last couple of years from Gallup, has indicated that there's really a population of people who are disengaged at work. And I know that kind of shifts a little bit over time. But what do you think are the biggest challenges for leaders in terms of employee engagement at work?
You are right. We're just about to release our annual State of the Global Workplace report. Last year, the 2024 report, only 25% of Australians and Kiwis were engaged at work, which is huge considering that we work almost 82,000 hours in our lifetime. The only thing that we do more than work is sleep. And I think most of us feel that we're probably not always getting enough sleep. So work it takes up a huge amount of time in our life, and yet many people are just not engaged at work. On the 16th of April, we released the new report, and I can give you a little heads up that unfortunately our engagement in Australia has gone down even more.
Has it really? Yeah.
So
And does that correlate with global as well? Like, is it
yes,
trending in the same direction? Yeah.
it is indeed. So there's a few things I think that we need to be aware of when it comes to engagement at work. And when you look at productivity globally, productivity is flatlined and stagnated. In Australia, our productivity has been really stagnating for a while. We're starting to get things boosting up again. But engagement and productivity are related, right? Because it's about performance. So it makes sense that our engagement stagnated, if our productivity is stagnated. I think we need to change the way work is working for people. There's a real parent-child relationship with work. People don't feel appreciated. We can see that with just scanning the headlines in the news. You see in Australia things like the Great Resignation, we had the Great Resignation. Now we've got the Great Reframe, where people are starting to think about how they reframe work. You've got things like managers leaving in droves with like a TikTok viral sensation, which is about bare minimum Mondays, quietly quitting. All of these things really indicate to us that people are not thriving at work, or not everyone at least. And because at Gallup, we study well-being, which our definition of that is a life well lived. We know that work has got a disproportionate impact on a life well lived. And we believe that it can be fulfilling, it can be developmental, it can be community, it can be social and boosting, and it gives people an opportunity to make a contribution. Yet if you look up the word work in the dictionary, what do you see? Very negative connotations. Some of the words associated with work are things like toil, drudgery, labor, exertion. It's negative, and people say, oh, I've got to go to work. They got the Sunday scaries. We've got Mondayitis. We just have to reframe it. And I think part of that job for leaders is shifting that parent-child relationship we have with work. That it's adults making a contribution using their strengths. That's what the best high thriving teams are. It's not the top-down approach anymore. It's workplaces and work groups with high trust, with high hope, with shared purpose, and those are the ones that are really thriving. But, some of the older hierarchical systems go back to World War I, when we're organizing things based on, quite frankly, military standards and standardization. And so we need to rethink work. We need to see people as individuals making a contribution rather than a resource. We want to chuck out that word human resource. Whoever thought of calling people resources, I don't know. But we've all got strengths. We all want to make a contribution. I don't believe anyone rolls out of bed in the morning and says, I'm going to go to work and do a really lousy job today. I think everyone wants to do good work because that's part of human nature, to have that efficacy. And so it's just reframing what work means to people. We've got a lot of work to do in that space.
Yeah, definitely. You're giving me flashbacks. I remember being introduced to someone as human resources and they said, "Oh, human remains" at me, and I was like, "Oh, wow, I've never heard that before. That's not what I think of when I think of human resources or people and culture, as I prefer to call it." So you've talked about this reframe, and I think that's quite important so that the way that people look at work itself changes. What can leaders do? You've sort of touched on a few things. Is there anything very kind of tangible that leaders can do to tackle some of these engagement challenges?
I think the first thing is, and this is going to sound really simplistic, but it comes down to a formula of having one meaningful conversation a week with each person on their team, their direct reports. When it comes to engagement, it really is a contact sport. It doesn't happen in the isolation of conversations. And so without that contact, without those meaningful conversations, it's really hard to understand where people's needs are not being met. It's hard to understand what barriers there are to them. And it's really hard to know them and to know their strengths so that you can care about their development, care about them making a contribution and optimize that. So we're, social beings, we need that connection. So the formula would be one meaningful conversation a week. And then if you touch on those 12 elements of clarifying expectations, making sure people have what they need, having an opportunity to recognize them, having an opportunity to see that they're contributing their strengths to that, demonstrating care for them as a person, you can almost hit on all of the 12 elements in the engagement Maslow's hierarchy
Mm.
in one single conversation. But a conversation can be net positive or net negative. So if you show up in that conversation with a bit of intention, then it can be really boosting. So that's a super practical one. There's nothing worse than ignoring your team members and not having the conversation with them. I think that is really disengaging for people. And then the next thing I would say is, the one of the big things that came out of our recent global research on leadership is we flipped it on its head, and it's one of the largest global pieces of research on leadership looking at what followers want. So rather than looking at what leaders should do, it's what followers need in order to kind of go with leaders. Because if you don't have followership, you don't have leadership. And there were four key needs. The biggest one was hope. And I think that if we look around on a global stage, people want to see a hopeful future. It's really important. So that's tomorrow looks better than today. And we've got the resources and the means to create that tomorrow. So that's what hope theory is. And so people need that clear vision of where we're going as a team, where we're going as an organization. So the number one is hope. Number two is trust. Number three is stability, and number four is compassion. So those are the four needs of followers. So if you think about in your communications, creating hope, demonstrating compassion, trying to create stability, what stays the same, even though we're changing a lot. And then you build trust by following through, by letting people lead without needing to micromanage them. All of those things lead to trust. Then that will hit on those four needs of followers.
Excellent. Love that. When we think about a lot of the research tells us, and obviously Gallup being a very strengths based organization, but the research tells us that people are happier and more productive when they're leveraging their strengths and using their strengths every day. And there's lots of data points that support that. So, how does Gallup's strengths help teams tap into their own individual purpose, their own why?
And yeah, so people that use their strengths every day are 6 times more likely to be engaged at work. The challenge is we all know our weaknesses and we can't always fix them. Even though we've got weaknesses, we've all got weaknesses. We probably have spent time trying to fix them and we've probably still got weaknesses. The challenge is not a lot of people can articulate their strength. And the great work in this is to help people discover their strengths, put a language to it that they can understand and they can talk about with efficacy and start to see how they can use that every day. Everybody's different. There's no such thing as a well rounded individual. We've all got our pointy edges, which are like the points on a star. And we spend a lot of time trying to fill the gaps in between the points, which just makes us get a bit better, but it doesn't help us kind of get to excellence. When you think about athleticism, that is a strengths-based approach. If you're a goalkeeper on a soccer team, you don't train to be a midfielder, you train in goals to be the best goalie you can be, and everyone knows that's your strength. And the same should be true in a team. If you know your strengths, you make your biggest investment in your areas where you've already got energy and you've got efficacy and you've got talent, and that's where you'll get excellent. And that doesn't mean that you don't have to manage your weaknesses. We absolutely do, because otherwise it gets in the way for us. But our biggest ROI is going to be in investing in our areas of strength. So when we can know our strengths, talk about them, articulate them, and then aim them at performance, that's when you get excellence. It's when you get a lot of great understanding and synergy in a team as well, because in a team, you start to see people for what they contribute and the way they do things differently. And you see those differences as advantages rather than having a team where everyone's real samey. And that doesn't kind of allow you to be innovative and leverage each other's strengths and kind of manage around blind spots. So we talk about a framework: name it, claim it, and aim it. So the first thing you need to do is name your strengths, so actually understand what they are. Then you need to claim them, so build efficacy around them, start to spot when you're using your strength, and then it needs to be pointed at performance or at a goal or at a team challenge or at purpose, the mission. So that simple framework, and that's used a lot in psychology, is naming it, claiming it, and then aiming it. And if you could do that at a team level, that's just so powerful.
Yeah. And do you have any practical ideas? Like, I do a fair bit of work with leadership teams, and I've got a few activities or things that we might do to help people both name and claim their strengths so that the team can then work out as a team, how can we leverage each other's strengths? What are some suggested things that a leader could do with their team to be able to start naming and claiming? And I just I think it's interesting culturally. Sometimes people feel really uncomfortable talking about their strengths. I feel like they're being arrogant or not being humble or feel a bit uncomfortable with that. So I think it's really important that we kind of collectively do it as a team. So what are some suggested things that you'd put in place?
Yeah, definitely. It takes time to build that fluency where people start to feel less awkward about talking about their strengths. But when you get to that point and when you've got the shared language around it, it makes it easier because there's a common understanding. I could say, I've got high competition, and that might mean something negative to you, but in the strengths science and in that common language, we know actually that's super powerful. And that is a great benchmark and barometer for trying to lift the outcomes of the team. So, a really simple activity that leaders can do is called Best of Me or Best of Us. And basically, you don't need any strengths instruments to be able to have this conversation. It's a simple conversation that answers three questions. You get the best of me when each person fills in the blank. You get the worst of me when each person fills in the blanks, and you can count on me too, or this is what I need from you. So you can use either one of those last questions as the third one. But you get the best of me when allows people to say in a really safe way, for example, when you help me set goals and then you get out of my way and let me find my own way to the outcome, when you trust me, or when you give me really honest feedback, when you give me all the information. So they're able to say what works for them and where they show up best, what they need from each other in the team in a way that's really safe and it's not judgmental. For example, you get the best of me when the person with high intellection might say, when you give me time to think, you don't put me on the spot. I do my best preparation when I've got space and time to think and I can come along to the meeting. to make a contribution, but when you put me on the spot, because of my intellection, I actually need time to digest that information. So you can have a conversation around where people are going to thrive and flourish best in a really safe way. That is such a conversation. I recently did one with an executive leadership team, and it was almost 3-hour conversation just with those 3 questions for each member of the exec.
Yeah. I've used that particular exercise, and the feedback after the whole day was that was the most powerful part of the day. And I do think it's this combination of sharing in your own words what your strengths are, but it's also almost a feedback opportunity as well for people to say, and this is how you can kind of aim that so that I can be at my best as well. And I think that makes it really powerful too. So I like to think of purpose on a few levels. I think about your own values individually, then connecting to the work that you do and the meaningful work that you do. Then there's the team's purpose, why the team exists, and then there's the org's purpose. So what strategies have you seen work best to align individual strengths or values with the team's purpose?
That's a great question. I think I'll just start by saying one of the things that we have noticed in the big data is that connection to mission and purpose is decreasing, particularly for younger generations, unfortunately, because it's also cited as a big reason why they join an organization or a team. They want purpose driven work, and yet they're less connected. So, that connection we're seeing globally going down, which is a great opportunity for us to reconnect people. When it comes to the team's purpose and how it relates to strength, the purpose I think of is the what and the strengths is the how.
Mm.
So my strengths is my how and your strengths is your how. And we might share the same purpose and mission, but the way that we are going to deliver on that will be really different based on who we are and how we get things done and what our kind of default settings are, which is our talent. And I think the role of a great team leader or manager is to help personalize that purpose for each individual and bring it to life so that they can see the connection between their role and their strengths and the team's purpose. And the example I always talk about is you've got 3 people in the same job. One of them says, I'm laying bricks. The other one says, I'm building a wall. And the third one says, I'm making this hospital. And so it's the same job, it's the same task, but the way they see the importance of it or their contribution, back to this word contribution, is really different based on the personalization of their connection to it. So I think a really effective team leader or manager can help people see the connection no matter what role they're in. We've all heard the story of or read the story about the janitor at NASA that tells everyone who's helping put humans on the moon. And that story is in Now Discover Your Strengths, which is one of Gallup's strengths-based books. But it's about really helping people see how they do fits in to the overall purpose of the team and then of the organization and the greater good. And so that I almost think of team leaders and managers as translators of that for people, helping them see that line of sight, that connection.
Yeah, it's so important. And I love those two stories you've given about laying bricks versus building a hospital, and actually like the janitor seeing the connection to the bigger purpose within the organization. And I think our role as leaders is to help understand our people individually and what they value most, but also how they actually connect in to the overall strategy. Yeah. So I want to pick up on this Q12 question, the controversial one you mentioned before, because I often talk about in teams, we need to get to know each other beyond the work. We need to get to know each other on a human level. And I often follow it by saying you don't need to be besties with the people that you work with, but you need to have strong relationships, to have productive relationships. Having said that, the Gallup research tells us that if we do have a best friend at work, it correlates to being twice as engaged at work. So why is this so important? Like you touched on it before, but why is the work bestie so important? And, for those that don't have work besties, like how can they feel more connected to the people around them?
It's a really fun one. I have been working at Gallup for 18 and a half years. And there's been times when I've thought, gosh, I wish we just didn't have this question. There's like so much conversation around this question. It's quite a polarizing item. The reality is when we were looking at, and when we continue to look at high thriving, high performing teams, when we changed that extreme wording, so we said, I have a good friend at work, I have a confidant, I have a great friend at work, it just didn't sort the conditions between the high performing teams and the low performing team.
Oh,
So it
interesting.
really is one of those differentiating factors. It links really strongly to safety,
Right.
both psychosocial safety, psychological safety, and physical safety. We've even got examples with reduction of safety incidences on construction sites with massively reduced when this element was, the needs were met around this element. And attrition, you're more likely to show up if you've got a best friend at work. It is a higher order need. So in the hierarchy of need, it's Q10 out of the 12. So it isn't a basic need. You need to get the basics right. There's no point having best friends at work if you don't know what's expected, you're walking around without feeling recognized, you don't feel appreciated, if you don't feel like your manager cares about you as a person. So it's not one that is at the base of the pyramid, but when you start to get that real high performance, that sustained high performance, it's really important to all of those things. And I think about with executives, I think the reason why it comes up so much is because at that level, maybe your best friend, you don't need a best friend within that group. But certainly for the workforce, the teams that are there every day on the shop floor, they're on the construction site, they're driving the trucks, they're outdoor workers, they're desk workers, whatever their role might be, we have to have fun at work. We have to have some kind of social connection. We do work almost 82,000 hours in our lifetime. Australians do. So, gosh, wouldn't that be a different scenario if we actually had someone that we could confide in, that we knew had our back, was looking out for us, and that we enjoyed seeing? So that's kind of the science behind it.
Yeah. It's such an interesting one because I reflect on some of the teams that I saw as being the highest performing, and I probably did have a work bestie or a work wife, as I probably referred to them. It's an interesting concept in the context of high performing teams. Obviously, more and more teams are working either remotely or in hybrid ways. How do teams build that meaningful connection, and how do we do that in the hybrid world?
Yeah, it really comes down to being very intentional about the conversations. The conversations matter when it comes to well-being. Other people matter. So it's about really creating opportunities for those meaningful conversations, not letting it slip. In addition to that, working on tough things together brings people together. Working on challenging things together really creates a lot of trust. So that shared purpose that we talked about earlier, when you get to tackle great assignments, that's when you start to build trust and connection and shared purpose. It is harder to do in a hybrid mode, but it's not impossible. And we've proven, I think, over the last 5 years that it can be done. It just has to be intentionally managed.
Yeah. Because you mentioned trust, and it's one of those things that often trust takes a while to build. And I do think that people galvanize in a crisis or on those tough challenges, like you've said. What are some ways that teams can build trust quickly? Are there any tangible things that teams can do to do that?
I think the first thing is getting to know on a personal level the people on the team. So actually taking the time to understand them, their ways of working, I would say their strengths and also their non-strengths. I often think about, and I guess my follow-up part to that is, and then appreciating them for their strengths and their non-strengths.
Mm.
I often think about people with different working styles and how that can create tension in the team without having that language to put around it, it's, it can create a lot of dysfunction and toxicity if you don't understand why someone's working the way that they're working. I'll give you an example. I was working with a leader who had a lot of really fast working style. So in the Clifton Strengths language, she had high activator, achiever, maximizer, competition. These words, these strengths might not mean a lot to everybody if you're not familiar with the Clifton Strengths language, but she was really fast paced. And until she discovered the strengths and put some language around and started to work and appreciate other strengths, she didn't realize that she actually had a bias around people working fast, being fast, speaking fast, and she would judge them on an interview based on their pace. And so this was pre-COVID. She'd meet them at the front, walk them to the interview room. By the time they sat down, she already knew that whether they were going to fit in or not based on how fast they walked, how fast they talked, and whether they could match her pace. And it wasn't until she opened her eyes to that blind spot that she realized that doesn't mean that they can't contribute really well. And in fact, that slower pace, that more thoughtfulness, that deliberative might bring a more analytical lens to something that I'm activated on. So it helped her to appreciate the differences as advantages. And someone's work style being completely different didn't mean that they weren't a high performer. It just meant that they took more time to think things through. They maybe assessed the risk more. They were more thoughtful in their responses. So she learned to appreciate that more by opening her eyes to it. So I guess to come back to your question, how do you build trust? I think the first thing is understanding that differences are advantages and that everyone is different. And they're going to bring a cognitive diversity to their role. Two people, same role, similar background, completely different working styles, different strengths. So really bringing that respectful understanding that differences are advantages in a team, that we those differences to make a strong team rather than everyone thinking and acting the same is really going to benefit the team. And that's where the trust starts, because that's where most of the problems come from. Why did he do this? Why didn't he do this? Why is he not getting back to me fast enough? That's where most of the challenges come from.
Yeah. And it's an interesting one in the context of the lens that we see the world in and how we might judge those that are different to us. And I think it highlights the shadow side of our strengths, because it's often our greatest strengths. The shadow side of those strengths is actually what our weakness might be. And I'm a big believer in teaming where it's all about understanding our similarities and our differences so we can value those things as well. Yeah. So in the context of that, like, how did teams best leverage the strengths of each other? And also, I guess, the lesser strengths that you mentioned too.
Yeah, it's so fun when you get to really get crunchy with this, because if you think about a team and you think about a profile, there are going to be areas where we're the same and there's areas where we're different. There's going to be people on the team that have a different lens and they bring a completely different perspective that might be a blind spot for us. So when you really start getting into it, it's that kind of appreciation of each other's differences as advantages. It's understanding where we're the same and where we're different. It's understanding where we've all got blind spots. I've seen teams that are all really strong on relationship building themes, and yet they don't have a lot of influencing themes. And there might be someone on the team with strong influence. So then they need to create some strategies or accountability plans about how to leverage intentionally the strengths of that person, to be able to go to that person and say, what are we missing? We're not seeing the world through that lens. Who else do we need to tell about this great work that we're doing? Who else needs to know about it? How do we do our own PR? So that is really powerful. And then coming down to power of two, like having complementary partnerships. So my best partners, I've got a lot of the influencing themes and the people themes. My best partners are the ones with the strategic thinking themes, the deliberative, the analytical, the ones that can bring some of the data to some of the strategy that I'm working on. So it's about finding your complementary partners, the people that have strengths in your areas of non-talent. And then it can get really fun. And then using that conversation around, you get the best of me when, you get the worst of me when, this is what I need from you. You can count on me to do this. Then you can start to leverage each other's strengths, start to recognize and see each other's strengths in action. And then it gets really fun. And I would say when it comes to high performance, a strengths-based approach to development and performance does not mean ignoring weaknesses. What I've noticed is that you have more permission to have tough conversations when you're strengths-based, when you really truly appreciate someone's differences as advantages and what they bring and contribute to the team. It's also easier to say, hey, I need to have a tough conversation with you about where this wasn't fulfilling performance and engagement, and where this really did get in the way for you and for others. And because you're strengths-based and you appreciate each other, it almost permissions those tough performance conversations even more. Whereas if you don't have that strengths-based approach, it feels like everything's punitive, everything's judgmental, the feedback's not really tangible. Back in the past, it's not future focused, and it's really hard to get clear on what the feedback is. But when you put a strengths language to it, as you say, it could also be that talent that's showing up in a negative way to someone. It allows them to tweak it.
Yeah. And I think it's so important, even using strengths-based language so that people can be really specific about what's positive, because sometimes positive feedback isn't great because it's so vague and not specific. So often we can take a strengths-based approach, but also lean on our strengths in terms of how we can help those strengths with the areas that are weaknesses for us as well, and being aware of that. But I think it's important not to be blind or just completely ignore weaknesses. I think that's a bit of a misconception about us taking a strengths-based approach, that we don't talk about weaknesses, and it's still important also. So thinking about leadership, what leadership behaviours have you found most impactful to build thriving teams in the Gallup research?
So some of it we've talked about, and those 4 needs of followers are really important. So that global research spans 55 countries, and unanimously, those are the 4 requirements of, for want of a better word, followers. People are looking for hopefulness. They're looking for that vision of the future. They want to believe that tomorrow is going to be better than today, and that enthusiasm is built around that. They want leaders that create or have high trust. They want people to see them as individuals and have that compassion. And then because we're going through so much change, it's even more important for leaders to double down on what is stable, what remains the same, what can you count on. I talk about this a lot when it comes to leaders. Being a consistent leader is really important. Everyone can think about a bad boss that they've had at some point in their career, and not knowing what you're going to get that day is probably one of the hardest things about having a mediocre or a lousy manager, is that one day everything's rosy and the next day they're in a bad mood and you never really know where you stand. And there's just nothing worse than an inconsistent leader. Even if we're going through tough times, we're navigating really big challenges, it's important to be consistent and stable as a leader for others. That's really tough, especially in this current climate. So I would say creating hope and talking about it every day. Where are we going? What are we working on? What does that look like when we get there? Just really creating a vivid future and line of sight to how to get to that future, demonstrating trust. The ways you can demonstrate trust is in meaningful conversations, leading at your level. Don't do tasks that you can delegate. It's really important. If ask yourself, is this something I should do or something that others will grow and develop in if they do it? Another way to build trust is defining the outcome and getting out of someone's way and letting them do it without micromanagement. I think that's something that nobody really appreciates, being micromanaged. So those are ways to create trust. And then compassion is care about the whole person, understand when things are tough, when you're going through lots of change. Now, there is a lot of sensitivity in the world of work at the moment, particularly when you think about some of these challenges like navigating the conversation around DE&I rollbacks at
Mm.
global stage, but people are sensitive about it in this market as well. Return to office. There are offices that are calling people back 5 days a week, giving them just 4 weeks notice. There's a lot of sensitivity at the moment, and we don't have the resiliency around it because we've got lower engagement.
Yeah, which makes it harder for those things to land.
Yeah.
So, sorry, go.
Well, I wanted to just add one more thing, and that's around measure what you treasure. I think it's really important to measure the right thing. Not everything that can be counted counts. That's what Einstein said, not me. But, I do see a lot of surveys, employee opinion surveys that are measuring things that don't actually link to the right things. They might be measuring aspects of motivation or pay and benefits or satisfaction elements. They're not necessarily linked to high thriving, high performance. And that's problematic because what you measure gets managed. So
Yeah.
using evidence-based items, not adding the 4s and 5s together. You'd be so surprised how many organizations are adding 4s and 5s together and reporting on positive sentiment saying, we've got 82% engaged. We don't have 82% engaged. Let's have a look at your attrition. Let's have a look at your stress claims. Let's have a look at your performance. Let's have a look at your sales. Do we really have 82% engaged? Probably not. There's a very big psychological difference between 4s and the 5s. This people score, whatever it is that you're measuring. I'm not saying it has to be the Q12, but I'm saying make sure it's evidence-based construct, that it is linked to performance and high thriving outcomes, and that it is actually based on fact, not ideologies, really is grounded in research. That's what's going to be the metric that we should stare at just as much as we're staring at EBITDA and some of those other kind of traditional measures of business prosperity.
Yeah, I completely agree. I feel like accountability and feedback sometimes have negative connotations. And I think there are links to the comment you made before about micromanagement. Based on your research, why is accountability and feedback so important in a thriving?
Accountability and feedback is just essential for growth. If we don't get feedback, we can't grow. Everything's feedback. It's not always true. So I think we also need to make sure that we taking that growth mindset, looking at the feedback, looking at it. Is it a pattern? Is it a one-off? What can I learn from that feedback? And having that really meaningful conversation around it, but then actually following through on the behavior change. So if we do receive feedback and we're starting to see it through the lens of, yeah, I can see that. I've heard that a few times now. Actually, what new habits or routines or rhythms can I create that are actually going to help me take on that feedback and grow through it? But that really requires that self-awareness and the growth mindset. The honest feedback, and in teams where there's high trust, there's shared purpose, and there's psychological safety, and those teams having conversations with each other on a regular, meaningful basis. So those are some of the ways to create fertile ground for having great feedback and giving great feedback and receiving great feedback that's actually useful, that isn't coming from a place of being punitive or judgmental. It's really hard to grow and take the feedback when it feels judgmental. Most people shut into survival mode. And when you're in survival, you can't learn. So high trust environments, shared purpose, lots of great conversation. And then it's easier to take that accountability and follow through on the feedback.
Yeah. And I think teams can hold each other accountable when they've got a shared purpose and there is that psychological safety and trust. It makes it easier to be able to do that because otherwise egos or agendas get in the way. So my very final question, Claire, is if you could leave our listeners with one key message about thriving teams, what would that be?
Oh, that's a great one. Only one? Okay,
Mm.
I'll give it. Let's find a place where we appreciate everyone for their contributions. A teams where you're never as strong as when you've got your most recent successes in mind. This is grounded in positive psychology. But when we feel efficacy, we start kicking goals. And it happens for everyone. As soon as they start feeling recognized, appreciated, guess what happens? You start doing more good things. And that happens in teams, that happens in families, it happens in almost any context. Is when you start to feel like, oh, I'm doing something good and someone appreciates me for it, you start to do more good things that you're more appreciated for. So there's a real psychology to it. So I would say let's appreciate people for their contributions, know their strengths, see those as advantages and start to recognize them. And that really is going to set everything else up for boosting. As I said earlier, I really don't think there's anyone rolls out of bed in the morning and says, I want to go and do just a really mediocre job today. I want to just get through the day. That's how they feel potentially, but it doesn't have to be that way. I think people can feel very differently about their contribution. They can have a lot of efficacy in their contribution. But it's up to everyone to appreciate each other and set up that ground for that to really thrive.
Yeah, I completely agree because I think the outcome is people feel valued and we know when people feel valued, they're going to perform better too. Awesome. Thank you so much, Claire. I got a lot of value out of our conversation today. So I just want to say a huge heartfelt thank you for taking the time to catch up with the Thriving Leaders podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I loved it. Thank you.
Thank you. That's it for today's episode of the Thriving Leaders podcast. A huge thank you to Claire for bringing such deep insights backed by data and real-world experience on how leaders can create thriving, high-performing teams. From the power of weekly conversations to the role of hope and trust in leadership, this conversation reminded us that the human side of leadership is what drives real results. If you found today's episode valuable, please share it with colleagues or leaders who might benefit. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. Until next time, keep thriving. Thanks for joining us at the Thriving Leaders podcast. If you'd like to find out more about our leadership programs, including our Thriving Leaders program, Thriving Women in Leadership and Thriving Teams, as well as executive and team coaching, keynote speaking or facilitation, head to our website, www.thrivingculture.com.au. This is also where you can sign up for our newsletter, where I share useful leadership and team development insights and tools, as well as our podcast. You can also grab your copy of my book, Thriving Leaders, Learn the Skills to Lead Confidently. It's also available at all good online retailers on Audible, Spotify and Kindle. If you liked this episode, I'd be so grateful if you left a 5-star review, as it helps us reach more people and therefore helps more leaders thrive.